All right, so Republicans have only been in power in the House of Representatives for about a week at this point, and already they are showing their hands in terms of how completely absurd and corrupt and ridiculous their program actually would be if they managed to somehow get power in the Senate as well as the presidency. So the latest thing that they have been trying to do, as predicted for months now, I've been talking about this on this channel, that this was inevitably going to be their main push, is basically trying to slash widely popular and desperately needed government programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security by weaponizing the artificial debt ceiling and talking about the deficit and fear-mongering surrounding those issues in order to push austerity on working-class Americans. So here from Common Dreams, Kenny Stansel, he says, as the debt ceiling alarm sounded, GOP accused of plotting a terrorist attack on the economy. Now, you might look at that and say, okay, that seems a little bit like hyperbole, but as we get into more details here in terms of like how many people would be affected if the GOP actually got their agenda through in this way, which again, obviously they can't right now because of the Senate, but they're basically going to try to weaponize this to force Democrats in order to abide by the cuts that they want to these programs. But I mean, again, terrorist attack might seem like hyperbole, but given the fact that this is going to negatively impact millions of people and potentially plunge them into poverty, I don't think it's that hyperbolic. So they start off here saying that as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned on Friday that the United States is likely to reach its arbitrary borrowing limit. Again, emphasis on the arbitrary, because this is all made up bullshit here that they weaponize to push austerity, but they say the arbitrary borrowing limit is going to be reached next week, and progressives denounced congressional Republicans for threatening to use a debt ceiling standoff to force cuts to popular programs, including Medicare and Social Security. They got a quote here saying they have the tiniest majority of one house, and they are prepared to use it to get concessions that they know are incredibly unpopular, said Dean Baker, the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, telling the Washington Post that it would be a terrorist attack on the economy. Okay, so this is the Republican Party for you, right? I mean, again, shouldn't be surprising to anybody in any way, shape, or form, but they were essentially trying to hold the entire American economy, the American people, hostage, and potentially risking plunging the global economy into a recession in order to do what exactly? To slash Medicare and Social Security based on what? The complete lie, the false premise that we have some sort of like an artificial debt cap, that if we reach that suddenly every American is going to have to go into their wallet and pull out money in order to pay off the US debt or something like that. I mean, it's complete horseshit, right? I mean, I've talked about this so many different times on my channel, especially using the lens of modern monetary theory in order to understand these issues. Really, the only cap in terms of how much money the federal government can spend has nothing to do with the debt or the deficit. Those are just like accounting figures of how much money we've already spent. The real limit is on inflation, which our current inflationary crisis is largely being driven by corporate profits, not by, federal spending or anything like that. And inflation is the main issue that you have to worry about, as well as just making sure that you use taxation in order to, modulate or in order to balance out income and wealth inequality in this country. So, I mean, the idea that you have some sort of like a debt ceiling or a debt limit that we're suddenly going to hit, and that we have absolutely no choice but to cut these widely popular programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, it's just a complete lie. Okay, it's just an excuse for them to push austerity on working class Americans. But they continue here saying that in a letter to congressional leaders, Yellen wrote that the use of extraordinary measures enables the government to meet its obligations for only a limited amount of time, possibly through early June, and she implored Congress to act in a timely manner to increase or suspend. Again, you could just completely get rid of the debt ceiling. It's completely meaningless. You don't need it at all. So Democrats could have abolished that, but they're going to touch on that here in a second as well in terms of Democrats failing on that front. But Janet Yellen also warned that a failure to meet the government's obligations would cause irreparable harm to the U.S. economy, the livelihoods of all Americans, and global financial stability. So this is what they're willing to risk in order to get what they want, which is, again, just adding another level of brutalization of working class people in this country. But again, to touch on this, this idea up here is pointed up by Dean Baker, in terms of how unpopular a lot of these programs are and how completely nonsense this narrative being pushed by Republicans in this instance is, in terms of like, oh, we're running out of money, or we're not going to be able to fund Social Security, so we need to slash the government spending on this program in order to save it in the long run, or whatever the argument is nowadays. Just to give you a little bit more perspective on that, so here's basically an article from The Hill, which I thought was just a good simple explainer in terms of why this so-called problem with future funding for Social Security is complete and utter nonsense, and Republicans willing to force cuts on programs like Social Security is basically just a way for them to once again protect the millionaire class. So here from the Hill, they say make this the last year that millionaires stop paying into Social Security before the rest of us. So they say it's become a yearly ritual. Every February, we mark the date that millionaires stop paying into Social Security for the rest of the calendar year. Anyone earning $1 million in annual wages hits the Social Security payroll cap on February 23rd, while the rest of us continue to contribute to the program through the end of the year. This is fundamentally unfair, and the public knows it. The longer we wait and adjust the payroll wage cap, the worse for Social Security and its beneficiaries. This year, Congress has a real opportunity to take action if it has the political will. Now, this article is from early February of last year, so did they have the political will to get this done before Republicans won in the midterms? No, they absolutely did not. But they continue saying that the payroll wage cap for 2022 is $147,000. So once you reach that $147,000, it no longer is applicable to you, right? I mean, completely ridiculous. They say capping payroll taxes according to wages deprives Social Security of much needed revenue. The Social Security Trust Fund reserves are projected to become depleted by 2034 if Congress doesn't act to prevent it. And all you would have to do to prevent that is, again, lifting this cap. But they say contributions have been capped since Social Security was enacted 86 years ago, but in the ensuing decades, rising income inequality has pushed more and more people above the payroll wage cap. And in years past, 90% of wages earned in this country fell below the cap. Today, only 83% of those earnings are subject to the Social Security payroll tax. Now, that 7% increase might not seem like a lot at surface level, but that we're talking about, billions and billions of dollars that potentially could save a program that affects millions and millions of American lives, and throughout its history over the past 86 years has prevented millions of senior citizens from being subjected to abject poverty. But they continue saying that most Americans pay 6.2% of their wages into Social Security. Okay, most Americans, 6.2%. They say the effective tax rate for the wealthy is significantly lower, in some cases as little as 0.8%. Okay, average Americans, 6.2%, the millionaire and billionaire class, 0.8%, okay, or 0.08%, right? So, I mean, that's where the funding problem is coming from, right? So the idea that conservatives are pushing that, like, oh, Social Security is going to run out of money, we have to cut this program to save it in the long run. No, you could literally just raise the cap so that millionaires are having to pay more into this program, and that would save it. But of course, they're going with the alternative option, which entirely protects their millionaire buddies and forces the cuts on average working class people who are going to suffer the brunt of those consequences, right? So that whole narrative about Social Security funding is complete and utter dog shit. But just to add a little bow on top of this, as Dean Baker was pointing out before, in terms of the unpopularity of pushing cuts to Social Security. So just a little bit of perspective here from Data for Progress. They say some members of Congress are proposing new legislation to expand Social Security benefits, and they give a little detailed explanation of what exactly they're asking people. But to expand Social Security benefits in the United States, what are we talking about here? 83% of support, okay, with only 10% opposing. Okay, so only 10% oppose expanding Social Security benefits. Republicans are trying to cut Social Security benefits. Just another data point here. They also asked some members of Congress are proposing new legislation to expand Social Security benefits. This legislation would raise Social Security benefits for all beneficiaries in order to match the rising cost of living. And they also got specifically into this $147,000 cap that we were just referencing there. So how many people support raising that cap and expanding Social Security? Well, again, it would be 76% of the American people across the board. That's Democrats, Republicans, and independents, okay? 76% support, only 14% oppose. And again, instead of pushing to raise that cap, instead of pushing to expand it as the American people want, they are choosing to use the debt ceiling, this completely arbitrary and nonsensical financial weapon that they have in their holster, in order to push cuts to Social Security, which are immensely unpopular across the board among the American people. I mean, like, one of the least popular things that you could possibly do, and that is exactly what is Republicans' top priority right now, something they are willing to jeopardize the entire American and global economy in order to get done. Okay, that's the current state of the Republican Party for you guys. But they continue here. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy from California suggested before the GOP won its slim House majority in November's midterm elections that if elected to lead the chamber, he would refuse to lift the country's borrowing limit unless Democrats agreed to slash the social safety net and climate investments in return. Okay, so not just fucking over average working class Americans, you also want to fuck over future generations and the entire planet on your way to doing this, right? So they say to secure enough votes to win his drawn-out battle for the speaker's gavel, McCarthy made undisclosed promises to far-right lawmakers like Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, who I kind of gave a little bit of credit to during that fight in terms of the strategy that they chose to deploy against Republicans, right? Obviously, this is something I've pushed for members of the squad to use against the Democratic Party when they're in power, specifically when you have battles over the speakership. Of course, we don't need to rehash the whole force the vote thing, but point is, it's a good strategy to use a solid block of, members of Congress who have actual principles and support widely popular policies among the American people, to use points of leverage like this during these heated moments in order to extract concessions or to make demands and maybe get floor votes or maybe get certain, addendums to other pieces of legislation or just something in exchange for their votes for supporting a speaker or for, getting on board with other pieces of legislation as well. So it's definitely a good strategic approach that these Republicans like Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz chose to use. But again, the emphasis here is that they're using this to do what exactly, right? Because these people like Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert, they're not doing this as genuine, as they want to portray themselves, outsider, anti-establishment, populist fighters or something like that, right? They're doing this literally to push an even more far-right economic agenda that is even more subservient to billionaires and corporate America and the military-industrial complex than the actual rhinos within the Republican Party, as they call them, right? So, the idea that, these are some sort of populist outsiders, it's complete nonsense. They're doing this to slash programs that help millions of average working class Americans in order to do what? Save the precious debt ceiling or something like that, or cut the deficit marginally while not even remotely touching the Pentagon budget in a legitimate way whatsoever. But they continue down here, saying that the fight over the debt ceiling represents one of McCarthy's most difficult balancing acts, CNN noted recently, and this is just classic CNN here. They say, the California Republican will need to work with Senate Democrats and Joe Biden to cut a deal and avoid economic catastrophe without angering his emboldened right flank for caving to the left. Okay, so it's somehow caving to the left in order to, be opposed to tanking the entire global economy in order to, slash programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that help millions of Americans from, poverty and degradation. That's somehow caving to the left, I guess. That's the framing that they're choosing to go with there. But we're going to finish off here. They say, with a quote from McCarthy himself, we've got to change the way that we're spending money wastefully in this country, and we're going to make sure that that happens. So this kind of reminded me of just a typical Republican line whenever they're pushed back against some of these cuts to social programs, and basically they'll come out and they'll say, when people question them and say, oh, what about the Pentagon budget? They can't pass an audit. They failed 5 audits in a row. We're dumping nearly $1 trillion a year into this, into this branch of our government spending with the military and on all of these pointless wars overseas that cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars and all of these different arguments, right? And they'll turn around and they'll say, well, something that's about national security. We have to have a strong country, blah, 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 patriotism, USA #1, let's go. And then they'll turn around and they'll say, well, actually, the majority of our government spending, discretionary or non-discretionary spending, is actually going towards these programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So that's where our real focus should be in terms of getting our budget in order and bringing the deficit down to be somewhat closer to neutral, right? That's the argument that they'll put forward, but a simple follow-up question to that would be, well, okay, which one of these programs or, combination of programs is actually helping the American people, right? Is spending $1 trillion to be the global world police, right, to benefit the stock portfolios of some of these weapons defense contractors or something like that, is that actually helping the American people more than programs that are giving people healthcare, millions and millions of people access to healthcare, and lowering the amount of senior poverty in this country by millions and millions of people? Some of these programs are good investments for the American people, some of them are not, and yet you're going to see them pretty much exclusively targeting the social programs while completely leaving things like the military budget absolutely alone. But that shouldn't, again, be surprising to anybody who understands what the Republican Party actually represents. But they finish off here saying that notably Capitol Hill's deficit hawks do not support reducing the Pentagon's ever-expanding budget or hiking taxes on the rich to increase revenue. Okay, so curious. Again, you care about somehow, lowering the deficit and slashing the national debt, but you don't want to do the two most effective things that could possibly be done in order to address those problems, like cutting the Pentagon budget or raising taxes on the wealthy in this country. So again, they're not serious about the national debt and the deficit. They don't, spoiler alert, nobody in our government genuinely cares about that, right? There might be like a handful of them in there that do, but pretty much nobody actually cares about the debt and the deficit. When Republicans are in power across multiple different administrations, they hike up the deficit. They just do it to give, tax breaks to billionaires and corporations and to expand the military budget, right? They don't actually care about cutting the debt and the deficit. They just care about brutalizing working class Americans. That's all that they want to do while serving their corporate allies. I mean, it's very transparent exactly what's going on here. But I just want to finish off with this point about the IRS, because this is another thing that Republicans have been trying to slash funding to. But so they say, on the contrary, the first bill unveiled by House Republicans in the 118th Congress seeks to rescind most of the Inflation Reduction Act's roughly $80 billion funding boost to the IRS, a move that would help wealthy households evade taxes and add an estimated $114 billion to the federal deficit. So again, they're basically trying to say, we're trying to cut the national deficit and the debt by cutting the IRS budget by $80 billion, but in turn, the inevitable outcome of that is going to be that you are losing more than that amount of money in lost income in terms of, getting these taxes from people who are not paying their taxes through the IRS, right? I mean, it's just a completely backwards argument, but it cuts through to exactly what Republicans actually stand to represent, right? Slashing the IRS budget, and this is something they've just lied about up and down, through and through throughout this entire process, right? Number one, this $87,000 IRS, scary agent number that Republicans have been floating around. Number one, that's 87,000 new IRS employees, not agents like the people who go to people's doors or whatever. It's employees, right? A large portion of whom are basically just doing like data entry and other bureaucratic shit. 87,000 employees over 10 years. Okay, so roughly less than 9,000 new employees a year, and a majority of those are going to basically replace IRS employees or agents who are set to retire in the next 5 to 10 years because they're hitting retirement age. Okay, so basically the IRS funding boost of that $80 billion, the 87,000 new IRS employees or agents or whatever you want to call them, that was basically just to like barely replace the, staffing that they had at the IRS, the funding that they had. We're still not even getting it back to where it used to be in terms of funding levels and the resources that they have at their disposal. And all the while, Republicans are trying to pretend as if this is going to increase the amount that average Americans, working class, middle income people are getting audited by the IRS, while completely ignoring the fact that that's literally what they're doing right now, because they do not have enough resources to go after these billionaires and millionaires who have teams of lawyers who can defend their financial assets. So if you want to actually fix the problem with the IRS, you wouldn't slash funding for the IRS, which is going to do absolutely nothing but protect millionaires and billionaires. And even some people like Ted Cruz were coming out and saying abolish the IRS. I mean, it's literally just a transparent way, using this vague, veil of populism or anti-establishment or anti-deep state or anti-government approach and narrative that they have been pushing surrounding this in order to just serve the bottom line of corporate America, who of course they truly represent at the end of the day. So I mean, listen, obviously none of this shit is actually going to get through for the most part in terms of a lot of the pieces of legislation that they have been putting forward in the House of Representatives, because you do still have a Senate Democratic control. You do still have Joe Biden in the White House, but you are going to see this massive standoff that is brewing right now on the national debt and the deficit, which, just as a reminder one more time, are completely arbitrary and meaningless limits on federal government spending that have nothing to do with reality or our economy in any way, shape, or form. And they're going to weaponize these, the national debt and the deficit in order to try to force Democrats to comply with these slashes to these vitally important programs in this country. So Democrats should turn around to them and give them a double middle finger straight to the face and absolutely not abide by any of that. Now, will they? I don't know. Honestly, Joe Biden is not somebody I would put all my chips into expecting him to do the right thing at the end of the day on this. he's definitely, to some extent, one way or another, especially throughout his entire career in the Senate and under Obama, has been very concerned with things like the debt and the deficit, and also has been open to things like slashing Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So it's definitely in his wheelhouse historically throughout his entire career to get on board with some sort of nonsense bipartisan effort to address the debt and the deficit at the expense of average working class people. But hopefully he does not give in on this fight. Honestly, I think that if Republicans manage to successfully shut down the entire economy and the government, and potentially tank the entire global economy at that, in order to do something that is just one of the most unpopular policies you could possibly push by trying to slash these programs, then that would probably be a political win for the Democrats. So there's absolutely no incentive whatsoever that would justify giving into any of the demands that Kevin McCarthy is currently making in the House.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying